For our project, we'll be following groups of researchers to see how bias and confounding variables affect experimental validity. First, we'll talk about the Hawthorne effect, which is when participants act differently when they're alone than when they're being observed.
All right, and begin.
Next, we'll look at recall bias, where people misremember the past.
So, on a scale of 1 to 10, how difficult do you remember the MCAT meeting?
Well, let me think about it. Maybe like a 2 out of 10?
Next, we'll talk about measurement bias, when incorrect measurements affect the result.
All right, I'm going to listen to your heart now. All right, I'm going to listen to your heart now.
The results here would be invalid since we can't correctly hear the heart sounds in these conditions, affecting the internal validity. Next, we'll look at control selection bias through an experimental design.
Okay, so for our study, I think we should just use female smokers as our control group for our study on factory working conditions.
Here, women smokers do not represent the standard population. The comparison to the control, therefore, would be invalid. Also, the effects of confounding variables cannot be controlled for. To limit the bias here, you can attempt to match factory workers to a counterpart, which would reduce the effect of confounding variables and improve internal validity. We'll now move on to confounding variables, which are unknown or unaccounted for variables that can affect an experiment. A student researcher and PI are discussing experimental design for an exercise supplement advertised to all ages and genders.
For our experiment on the exercise supplement, we should sample women from the local all-women's gym.
See, that study would lack external validity since you can't apply the results to the general population. Additionally, the confounding variables like gender and lifestyle could alter the results with such a small and specific sample population. So to prevent confounding variables and maintain experimental validity, we can conduct random sampling, which accounts for confounding variables you can observe and those you can't. Simply controlling for variables is useful too, but you may not be able to control for them all. The last and most energy-intensive method is to match each person in the test group to a similar person in the control group. However, perfect matches are nearly impossible.
Now we'll summarize what we've learned. Bias comes in many forms. In addition to the ones we've already discussed, here are several more examples. Bergson's bias is when hospitalized patients are chosen for a sample. They may have more severe symptoms and better access to care, therefore altering the results compared to a non-hospitalized group. The Pygmalion effect is also called the observer expectancy effect and is when researchers believe in the efficacy of a treatment and therefore influence the outcome of a study. This can be avoided by blinding. Lead time bias is when patients with severe diseases do not get studied because they pass away. Observer bias occurs when investigators know the status of a patient. For example, a cardiologist interprets an EKG knowing that the patient has coronary artery disease. This can also be avoided by blinding. Confounding variables are those unknown or unaccounted for factors which alter the result of an experiment. Like bias, confounding variables can affect an experiment's internal and external validity. Validity can be thought of as internal validity, which is when we determine if we've accurately measured what we wanted to measure. External validity determines if the results can apply back to the target population or the general population. Both types of validity can be influenced by bias and confounding variables.